Xi Jinping is facing his biggest challenge in his decade-long reign in China. 3 decades after Tiananmen Square protests, the Chinese people are rising up again. This time, they're fighting back against COVID control policies that have been weaponized by the state to terrorize and subjugate 1.4 billion people. People in China are sick of living in a world where they can't leave their apartments for up to 100 days at a time, in a world where children are separated from parents randomly because of a COVID-positive test. The pursuit of zero COVID has taken on ridiculous and draconian proportions, where all of a sudden, thousands of people are stuck in an IKEA store, for example, or in Disneyland, because a positive case may have been detected. Over the last 5 days, people are now protesting. They're protesting in several cities across China. The Chinese authorities are quelling these protests by a crackdown on anyone who has been participating. Random checks and phone calls are being made. Meanwhile, China is hinting at relaxing its COVID norms, its zero COVID norms, in the face of growing anger. But is it too late? Already, the international community is speaking out after the United States, UN Human Rights Council, the IMF, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has also condemned the authoritarian crackdown on protesters, especially after a BBC journalist was assaulted and put under arrest for covering these protests.
We also need to evolve our approach to China. Now, let's be clear, the so-called golden era is over, along with the naive idea that trade would automatically lead to social and political reform. But nor should we rely on simplistic Cold War rhetoric. We recognise China poses a systemic challenge to our values and interests, a challenge that grows more acute as it moves towards even greater authoritarianism. Instead of listening to their people's protests, the Chinese government has chosen to crack down further, including by assaulting a BBC journalist.
Well, remember, protests in China are unprecedented. This is not a functioning democracy where right to protest peacefully exists. That's why all of these pictures you're seeing, people holding up white blank pages, is unprecedented. So what has sparked this anger? Let's tell you how it all unfolded. On 24th of November, a fire in Xinjiang's Urumqi, this is in western China, kills 10 people. Now, people are believing that these 10 individuals died because of COVID norms that hindered rescue ops, that didn't allow them to leave their apartments easily. The Chinese authorities have denied this. These protests start demanding an end of lockdown and have spread to at least 8 cities. By 26th of November, the blank white paper protest emerged in China, and that's an important one, because what the people holding up those blank sheets of paper are trying to say is that we are not allowed to voice what we are thinking and what we want to say. On 27th of November, protesters start demanding the resignation of President Xi Jinping. That's when a BBC reporter is detained and allegedly assaulted. On 28th of November, protests spread to Hong Kong, and the UK condemns crackdown of protests by the Chinese. The White House has also come in at this point and started speaking. But the protests have now been quelled. There are reports that police are cracking down. Those who are attending these meets are getting phone calls from the police in their home. Online censorship is intensifying. People are being stopped randomly to check whether they have VPN on their phones, because that's the only way they can access websites like Twitter, etc. So all of this is happening to stop the protests. And why? What is the genesis of all of this? All of this is in pursuit of Xi Jinping's zero COVID policy that he refuses to back down from. So what is the zero COVID policy? Essentially, it is zero tolerance to any new COVID cases. It means strict lockdown measures, complete isolation of anyone who tests positive, snap lockdowns and long quarantines. Why does he have to do this? Essentially because China's vaccine, the Sinovac, seems to have not worked very well. The population is still vulnerable. They haven't vaccinated enough of the elderly. Worse is, because of the stringent COVID measures, not enough people have been exposed to the virus and thus have lesser immunity. So will Xi Jinping finally be forced to abandon his draconian and impractical zero COVID policy? To speak on this, I'm joined today by Einar Tangen, Senior Fellow at the Taihei Institute. He's speaking to us from Japan. Adam Schwartz, political commentator, is joining me on the show. I'm speaking with Raymond Vickery, Senior Associate at CSIS, Captain Alok Bansal, Director, India Foundation, with us today, as is Suresh Kumar Goel, former ambassador. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for speaking with us today. Mr. Tangen, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Let me begin with just understanding what the Chinese government is going to do in the face of these protests and why these protests are being curbed. Because by all accounts, these are peaceful protests. Why can't people come out and, for example, silently hold up blank pieces of paper?
Well, first off, I'm in Beijing, so that might make a little bit of difference in terms of my perspective. So I'm actually, I was only a block away from where they were meeting. In China, they have a different system. I know that seems strange because everyone wants to have, thinks that you can only have one system, one democratic system. But let's look at how successful China has been in other countries. China has done very well economically. Its people, especially during the first part of the COVID time, they had 95% plus approval ratings. And these were surveys done by Harvard University, by Pew, et cetera. So it's not a question of whether or not this is true. They have. Now, is there frustration today? Absolutely, especially because of the World Cup. People in China saw people congregating, packed stadiums, players hugging each other, not a mask in sight. And they thought, well, maybe we're missing out on something. But, the reality there is not the reality here. In many of those countries,
may I just ask, Mr. Tangen, may I just ask, is it true that pictures of the World Cup, the live stream, is being censored so as to not show spectators without masks?
Yeah,
because these are reports.
Yeah,
is that how you are seeing the World Cup in Beijing, without the crowds and the shots of the crowds?
Well, quite frankly, I see it on an IPTV box, so I'm not censored in any way, shape, or form. I'm seeing exactly what the rest of the world is. In terms of the people at large who do not have that, who are looking at Chinese television coverage, yes, they are not showing pictures of the crowds. But, the issue here is not whether what other people are doing. Remember, during the peak of COVID, most governments failed their people, including the United States, which has the most advanced medical care in the world, most beds, and 1 million people died. Everyone likes to forget that. Even in India, you had tremendous issues. Of course, you do not have the advanced medical care and the money that the United States does. But each country responded in their own way, some successfully, some not so successfully. China has had less than 6,000 deaths. That's less than
but how is that relevant to what I'm saying today? Sir, how is that relevant to what I'm saying today? Because it's sounding a bit like spin.
You tried to paint a picture of China as a failed state and Xi Jinping on the verge of being pushed out of power. I'm trying to explain to you that that is not true at all.
All right.
That you can certainly voice your narrative, but it doesn't necessarily make it true.
The question I asked you, sir, and let's put my so-called narrative to aside, is why are people stopped
Why would you put your
from
narrative
protesting
to aside? You started out with,
No.
You should
I asked you a question. I asked you a question. I asked you a question.
But
I did ask you a question. I don't seem to be finding an answer. I'm asking you a question about today. You're talking about 2 years ago. So I'm wondering what the issue is. I asked you a question. Simple one. Why can't people protest peacefully with a piece of white paper in their hands? You're saying that doesn't work like that in China. What does that mean?
And in China, they have a different form. They have a representative form. They call it a representative democracy. It's different from your own.
Okay.
But it is something that they adhere to. If you believe that there's only one kind of government that should rule everybody, certainly you can believe that. That's American exceptionalism. You can follow it. But in fact, China's been very successful with a very different system.
All right, let me get Adam Schwartz in. Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. You've defended your position. Let me get Adam Schwartz in on this.
Not my position. I'm simply stating the facts.
As you see it, sir, if I may. On a debate, you'll have people who will see things from different perspectives.
Absolutely, and I welcome that. It
so
should be
as
backed
you see
up by
it,
facts.
as you see it, Adam Schwartz, let me come
Absolutely.
to you on the statements we've seen from world leaders. We've seen statements from the UNHRC. We've seen statements from the IMF. Rishi Sunak, of course, spoke today. There was a statement from the White House. Now, the question is this about China's track record with COVID control, or is this now becoming a question about human rights violations?
Well, I think it's, primarily a concern to do with human rights violations. I mean, I think, the fact that China may not necessarily be handling the pandemic as well as it should have is really, not a major concern of the West, other than the sort of economic implications that it has on trade to do with the lockdowns that we've seen across China that have sparked these issues. But really, I think, some of the comments that we've seen out of the West and last night, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak made a very dramatic speech when he said that the golden era of UK-Chinese relations was over. It's really important to understand that these protests that we've seen over the last few days, may have, sparked an opportunity to discuss China because it's really been in the world's eye for the past few days. But really, I don't think it really triggered actually the kind of major policy changes that Sunak and others are discussing. I think really, there are kind of two main reasons why the West is looking to kind of change its policy towards China at the moment, which are sort of interlinked. The first is that the post-Cold War theory that you can try to exert a sort of moderating influence over countries that you consider to be your adversaries through economic integration has really been dramatically debunked by the experience of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Clearly, Western, economic dependence upon Russian oil and gas has not provided any kind of leverage that it can use to change Russian policy. And I think, it's certainly very much to the opposite. And I think, the predominant view amongst Western policymakers is that, China will try to do the same with its economic dependency that it's built up from the West. And I think that the second aspect of that is that, the United States is really trying to leverage its leadership that it's taken over.
You know what, Adam? Can I ask you? Let's bring this closer. We're going all over the place, and I know that's because you analyze this from a geopolitical perspective. Let's talk about what the story is today. And of course, China's role as the second largest economy in the world is not questioned. We've seen crude prices gyrating depending on what's happening with their lockdown and their protests, etc. I'm talking about the protests and purely the political significance of protests in at least 15 to 18 cities and in universities in a country like China. What does that mean for the Chinese government?
Well, I think it's primarily a question of stability for the Chinese government. And I think, the kind of relationship, the social contract that the Chinese government has with its people is that essentially the government will provide prosperity and stability. And in return, the Chinese people, won't necessarily have to get the kind of political rights that you would get in Western democracies. And so I think, really the regime or the government in China is in a bit of a difficult situation because Chinese economic growth at the moment is currently the lowest level it's been really since the early 1980s. And so that kind of deal that the government has with its people really looks to be, sort of on the brink of not necessarily delivering what it's meant to be doing. And I think when you have that combined with a situation where people have been in a lockdown or an extreme version of lockdown in so many parts of the country for such a prolonged period, when you have a combination of that with the economy, together with this very tragic fire that happened, which caused the deaths of about 15 people, attributed by many due to the lockdown, it means that the frustrations that people have are being exacerbated. And of course, Chinese people are used to not having the kind of political rights that they do in the West, but clearly there is a limit to what they are willing to tolerate. And I think that's why you're seeing this, very unprecedented display of support on the streets against the lockdown policies.
Okay, Ambassador Goyal, let's put this into perspective. Does this mean that the Chinese government is becoming unstable? Possibly not. Do they have the wherewithal to stamp out these protests? Yes. But is that going to be enough? Now, that is the question, because we've already seen efforts to walk back from zero COVID. They're going to have to do that eventually, isn't it?
Tamanna, I mean, we often tend to think of situations in other countries from the prism of our own national perspective. And that is what is happening to our own analysis about what is happening in China. Now, what is happening in China is basically a protest against the zero COVID policy. Nobody has objected so far to the Communist Party of China. They are talking about Xi Jinping as responsible for the zero COVID policy, but not, repeat, not the Communist Party of China, even in Urumqi, even in Xinjiang, where the Chinese government is considered to be responsible for the oppression of the religious minority. That is point number one. Point number two, there are odious comparisons with what happened in 1989. I was in Beijing in 1989. I was there posted to the embassy in Beijing. Qualitative differences, really. Tiananmen was basically a protest against the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party against the intellectuals and academics. Here it is a protest against one specific part of the Chinese policies. Nobody has objected to so far about the Chinese Communist Party's role. Therefore, I think in this particular case, it's a question of management of a situation, and that management certainly should be able to resolve, if handled rightly, the problem at the moment. That will require a combination. Xi Jinping, of course, he has done that in the past. In August in Henan, dealing with the banking crisis, he will do it again. Use the hard measures, using the security and the police, etc., combined with some relaxation, not a complete relaxation, but some relaxation in the zero COVID rules to give a satisfaction to the people that, yes, I do listen to you. But given all that, really, I don't see the protest today or over the last 3 or 4 days converting into a wide-scale movement against Xi Jinping or the Communist Party of China. Tamanna.
All right. So he may not face a wide-scale movement. Does that take away from what is happening in that country right now and how the world is responding to it? Mr. Vikri, thank you for joining us on the show. How do you look at some of the comments that have come in from Rishi Sunak, from the IMF, from the UNHRC? Of course, since COVID-19, there has been this sort of move to reduce dependence on one source of any major import, and China is among them. But do you think that is deepening now?
I certainly do. Thanks very much for having me. And I think that the fundamental point here is that the significance of these protests goes far beyond COVID and the lockdown kinds of restrictions. The fact is that in democracies such as India or the United States or the UK, you have safety valves to be able to adjust when things are not being done properly. In the Chinese system under Xi, these kinds of safety valves have not existed, and they're becoming few and farther between. That adds to the instability of the system. I have long thought that in the long run, India is going to be more stable than China, because you just cannot ignore human rights, the basic urges of human beings to be able to think as they want, to speak as they want, and to be able to have freedom. And that is a basic difference under Xi in regard to how a protest is to be handled. One hopes that the kind of reaction that happened with Tiananmen, in which hundreds, if not thousands, were actually murdered,
will not be the kind of crackdown that happens here. But make no mistake, it has implications. The British Prime Minister has rightly stated some. In the United States, we're very much looking at the recalibration of what our economic relations are. It is not a solution just to say you're not going to trade because you don't like what somebody else is doing. But on the other hand, if you look at a track record in which China has made designs, claims Arunachal Pradesh, a state of India, as its own, has repeatedly tried to have its influence. It's going to have an influence, and friend sourcing, I think, will be the order of the day rather than just outsourcing.
So, Captain Alok Bansal, in terms of what next, the question now is how will Xi Jinping walk back from zero COVID? He has reiterated time and again that zero COVID is the basis. Is it time to abandon it? And is this proving that zero COVID was a mistake? Mr. Tangent began with talking about how successful China was.
See,
the fact is today it seems like the Chinese vaccine has not worked. They've not been able to vaccinate as many people of the elderly, and herd immunity has not built up. People are fed up.
Listen, Tamanna, authoritarian leaders have their own personal fads which they impose on the population. Chairman Mao imposed eliminate 4 pests. The entire youth was killing sparrows. Then they realized there is a drawback. Then they reverted back. During Great Leap Forward, each village had to set up a backyard furnace. The agricultural implements as well as household utensils were put into the furnace to create steel, and millions died. And now we have this zero COVID fad of the new dictator, that is Xi Jinping. Now, people are obviously reacting. It's a very, very huge protest, which we are seeing is very, very unique. It may not be as momentous, but it is happening in almost all major cities across China. Now, this is very, very significant protest in the considering the fact that how China views these protests, how draconian measures have been taken against these people. And yes, it is different from Tiananmen Square, but there is also a very big difference. When Tiananmen Square happened, there was no social media. You didn't have internet, you didn't have other things. And now, because of the social media, the news is spreading from one part to another. So I'm not trying to say that this is another Tiananmen Square, but the protests are significant. These are significant protests because people are defying authorities to come out because they are fed up. They are fed up because the zero COVID policy has actually locked down factories and they are without any sustenance.
Mr. Tangent, would you like to respond? You're looking bored.
And the vaccines that China has insisted on have not really...
let him finish.
Yeah. Sure. Mr. Tangent, you're looking decidedly unamused and uninterested in listening to what others have to say on what's going on in China. Is that how the Chinese government also feels when all, the UN, the US, everyone speaks out?
Yeah, no, it's how I feel. I'm an American citizen, but let's see here. The golden era has set for Great Britain. They have over 10% inflation. They've made a complete mess of things, and they're talking about nations and interests. And you have the United States, which by dictionary definition is a rogue state. It disregards treaties that it entered into. It does not follow the international organizations that it's itself created. For instance, doesn't recognize the ICC when it comes to American matters. It starts wars in Afghanistan, Iran, where Great Britain followed in, and they've abandoned Afghanistan. People are starving there. So you tell me why all this interest in China? I think the greatest fear that people in the colonial developed North have is that China and other nations will do to them what they did to others. And this hiding behind shared values is nonsensical. It just hasn't. What shared values? Right now, the United States is taking business away from its supposed allies in the East and also in Europe. European cars don't qualify for American subsidies if they're electric. The U.S. wants all of the chip manufacturers in Taiwan to, in essence, go to the United States. That would hollow out the Taiwanese economy. So, I hear all of these voices talking, and then I hear the Indian voice saying, well, Xi Jinping is on the verge of collapse. It's just nonsense. I'm here. I have my own view, but if you look at the facts, I mean, China's economy has been growing this entire time. You can't say that about any other economy in the world.
I'll get Captain Bansal to respond to you. But my point is, whenever I ask you something, you just talk about China's economy. I'm wondering why.
Well,
you're really deft. You're really deft. You're really deft at sidelining what the question is. We know China is the second largest economy of the world. We know it's the largest factory of the world. But does that allow you to? Does that allow you to separate? Does that allow you to separate mother and child because of a COVID positive test? 1 minute, Captain Bansal. Captain Bansal. Let's listen to Captain Bansal.
Well, no, let me finish. You tried to put words in my mouth.
Listen to him. Listen to him, and then you will respond. All right.
China has taken a people's first approach. You can't deny that. That's why they're in the situation they're in. They started opening up, and as a result of that, they've had a spread. Now they're trying to adjust. And now you're saying that they're about to on the verge of collapse.
But
I'd like to hear the captain
it's not working. COVID-0 is not working. It's a failure. Your people are telling you that. It's not worked.
Who's my people? The United States? I'm an American. I'm sitting here as an observer.
All right, Captain Bansal. All right, point taken. You're an American. Captain Bansal.
Firstly, to say that China has been a success story just because its economy grew may be a fallacy, because in the process of growing its economy, Mao killed millions in Great Leap Forward, in Cultural Revolution, in all these experiments that he did with his party and with his country. Now, is that sort of an authoritarianism desirable? The fact is that despite insisting on Chinese vaccine only, China's vaccine has not been able to build the requisite immunity. And as soon as there is a slight relaxation, despite the so-called zero COVID policy, today, the COVID numbers are rising in China. If you look at it, the rest of the world has actually removed all restrictions. Today, we are moving without masks, but in China, you still have a zero COVID policy. Now, that's having an impact on economy. The only shining thing which China had to show till now was economic growth. Now, even that economic growth is slowing down, authoritarianism continues. Even those role models which Deng Xiaoping had set up of 2 terms for the leaders have also been done away with. So obviously there is a discontentment which is now actually coming out because people feel here is a leader for life. We are seeing return to Maoism, and that is what happened during Mao's time.
My point is, let's put this in perspective. Because of protests, is the Chinese government going to fall tomorrow? No, because they have no elections to face. They just go, and they have enough of might to quell these protests. So we're not saying that the Chinese government is going to fall. My question is, the world going to silently watch and shut its mouth because of China's economic strength? That really is the question. Let me bring Ambassador Goel in on this. Ambassador Goel, at the end of the day, it boils down to that, right? Whether the world says, well, it's their problem. You know, Adam Schwartz alluded to it. They said for the West, it only matters what happens in China depending on how it's impacting us in terms of their economic strength. So no one really cares that 1.4 billion people have been living in a dystopian way.
Tamanna, a very valid question. If you listen to remarks made by Rishi Sunak today, he talked about the business can't be as usual, the golden era is over, etc., etc., etc. There was, however, a small qualifying remark at the end of it, when he said robust pragmatism. Now, what does the robust pragmatism mean? It can't be the Cold War era, etc. So I think every country is going to be basically watchful of what is happening there. They will not be silent, as you have seen so far. They will make the remarks, but ultimately they are going to watch the step to see how far they can go and where they have to stop. I think the balance has not come as yet. We will need to keep on watching. Eventually, every country is out there looking for their own interests. And most of these interests today are not just geopolitical or strategic. They are economic, emerging after the pandemic war. They do want to restore the supply chains, and China as an important part of the supply chain. Unfortunate, but that is the reality.
Okay. Adam, you know, that perspective, what happens next and what does Xi Jinping and the Communist Chinese Party do next? There are a lot of sort of murmurs out there on how they will retract from zero COVID. Maybe there will be a spin that the current variant is not very dangerous. It's like a flu. Maybe they'll say that already a lot of lives have saved. Mr. Tangent talked about 6 million lives being saved. That's the line that will be put forward. Basically, our work here is done. Let's open up. And in a way where face can be saved.
Well, I think, 6 million lives have only been saved if you ensure that actually that protection has longevity. And if you're going to try to change the policy that actually ends those lockdown policies in the context of, only 37% of over 80s, having 3 doses of the vaccine in China, in the context of China having very low intensive care capacity compared to other countries around the world, you're actually not going to be in the situation where you've saved them, but simply where you've actually delayed lives. And a lot of health analysts have actually looked at the situation in China, and actually if you were to completely lift all the lockdown restrictions at the moment, you may actually get up to 2 million people in hospital at any one time. And so, really there's no simple solution for the Chinese president in this situation, because he can either try to appease the protesters and actually change the policies and reduce the lockdowns, but that is going to result in a major social cost as well, as I've mentioned, from the health implications. Or you can try to continue with these policies, but actually result in risking further instability. So I think ultimately, there won't be either policy to the extreme. They will try to lift some of the restrictions in some of the areas that I would say are causing some of the most serious protests. But I think, we'll have to wait and see what is the determination levels of the protesters. Protests tend to be more intense in China on the weekends. So I think this weekend should certainly provide a lot of those signs that we're looking for, how this will end up. But I think, the final point that I would make is that the Chinese government will escalate the security response that it has to this to whatever level it sees necessary to put down these protests. I mean, China has a bigger internal security budget than its overseas defense budget. So I think certainly we will see more security, but as to the exact policy direction, I think we won't see a sort of total lift, and we won't see a total continuation of what we've seen over the past few years.
So if it's police versus protesters, it's no match. The police are going to overwhelm protesters. Now, the question is, how far is Xi Jinping willing to go to quell these protests, and why is it becoming harder? We're hearing about social media censoring. We're hearing about people being stopped suddenly to check their phones if they have a VPN to know how much information they're getting in. Mr. Tangent, your assessment of how this is going to pan out and what the response is going to be from the government?
Well, it's already been fairly robust. They put out a 4-point program today where they made it clear they're going to be concentrating on mandating vaccines, in essence, especially for the elderly. They're also looking at over this idea that you have local communities deciding whether or not they should shut down. They have, in essence, outlawed and putting up barriers that prevent fire and police and emergency vehicles from getting near these compounds. So they're taking measures. In terms of security, yes, they're absolutely right. They will crack down. The way they're doing it is they know where people are trying to arrange protests, and people who are wandering in that area are in fact asked to show their phone to see whether they have arranged meetings on things like Telegram, etc. This would not be tolerable in India or the United States or anywhere else, in Europe, for example, that the police would be able to do that. But China is a different situation. As was pointed out, they have one party. If something goes wrong, there's no scapegoat. You can't say, oh, let the other guys give it a try and see what they can do. They have done well so far in terms of planning and implementation, but that requires a lot of mistakes. So far, they've been able to remedy them. I think that they will move forward with a process where it's all about vaccinations, getting as many people as they can. I think the internal target is 60% of the population either boosted or vaccinated within the previous 6 months. At that point, they're already talking about a very low level of mortality, 0.025. That I think is, I believe, is acceptable because it's around what you would get with a normal flu. But I talked about the economic successes in the past of China, but the fact is, during this COVID time, and through poverty eradication and things like this, extreme poverty eradication, they've shown that they're very much people-centered. And a lot of people in the West object to that. They say it's too much socialism, that there should be more attention paid to the economy. It's a balancing act. It's not one or the other.
Captain Bansal, one interesting point coming out from Mr. Tangen's comments is point of perspective. He's saying that the cops stopping someone and checking their phone to see if they've arranged meetings would not be acceptable in India, the West, in Europe, basically in any functioning democracy, but it's different in China. Now, is this simply a question of different perspective, seeing things from different lens? Can there be differing perspectives on basic human rights? And, that's what we need to talk about at this point.
Firstly, we need to be very clear that, yes, for a very long period of time, I think Chinese society has been brought up in an environment like this. But what has happened is the decades of opening up, a large number of Chinese have gone out. They have they've been exposed to Western media. As I said, you go to China, although Facebook and WhatsApp are banned, everybody has a VPN. Every youngster you meet has a VPN, and you have an access to Facebook and things like Google and even WhatsApp. So there is a huge chunk of people, and I think in the cities, people will object and will be concerned by everybody being checked for their phone being checked. I don't agree that Chinese youth will accept it as a normal phenomena. Probably they may not have any other option. In any other country, they would have gone to court against it or would have protested against it. But in an authoritarian state like China, they would have no other option. They would have to probably bear with it. But to say that they will accept it and they will willingly accept it is, I think, to my mind, is flawed. I think China people have protested against the government policies even in the past. But unfortunately, Chinese authorities have dealt with it brutally. They dealt with it in Tiananmen Square. If you go back into history, you will see what happened during Cultural Revolution or even earlier. The authorities of the Communist Party of China have never dithered from using brute methods.
Maybe even though you have no political challenge, maybe though protesters are hugely outnumbered and don't have the same might as your state police, hopefully the political leaders will listen to the people. Hopefully that will come out of these protests at the very least, because clearly there's more to it than just being fed up of stringent COVID policies. Thank you so much for all of you to join us on this debate. I know it's very late where you are, Mr. Tangen, so thank you for staying up to talk to us.